Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this amazing podcast and webcast that's actually going to happen. It is co-sponsored by two amazing organizations, the Socrates Aspen Institute and the LBJ Library. Before we jump in, would like to tell you a little bit about the Socrates Aspen Institute. It was founded 24 years ago by Gary and Laura Larder, providing emerging leaders values and ethics-based learning through moderated sessions. The LBJ Library and primarily Future Forum, founded in 2002 by Catherine Robb, the LBJ granddaughter, to provide young professionals thought leadership through compelling programs and activities centered on public policy. Also within the LBJ Library, it is their 50th anniversary in the arena and also celebrating civil rights. Today we have an amazing program along with an amazing moderator. So let me go ahead and introduce our two panelists. Ms. LaShawn Warren is the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She most recently served as Senior Vice President of Campaigns and Programs at the Leadership Conference and the Education Fund. Previously, she served as Vice President of the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center of American Progress, where her work focused on the intersection of faith and public policy advocacy. Mr. Lawrence Norton is the Director of the Election Reform Program, where he leads the Brennan Center's work in a variety of areas, including its effort to bring balance to campaign funding and break down barriers that keep Americans from participating in politics, ensure that US election infrastructure is secure and accessible to every voter, and protect elections from foreign interference. And last but not least, our moderator, Dr. Victoria DeFrancisco Soto. She is Assistant Dean for Civic Engagement and a lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she was selected as one of the UT's Game Changers. She is also a faculty affiliate of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies and Center for Mexican American Studies, and appears frequently on the podcast Policy on Purpose, hosted by the library. Again, thank you everyone for joining today and enjoy the program.
Thanks so much, Lem. Greetings from Austin to our LBJ school friends and community, and to our new friends from the Aspen and Socrates program. As Lem said, this year the LBJ School celebrates its 50th anniversary. 50 years ago, President Johnson broke ground for our school to train the next generation of leaders. And in celebrating and commemorating this special moment, we launched the In the Arena series to bring together the foremost experts on different policy issues to engage broader communities. And today we are thrilled to be digging into the very timely and important issue of election, and more particularly free and fair elections, which are the base of our democratic system. And it seems easy, right? You vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Well, you know, with the asterisks of the Electoral College and the presidential vote, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's far from simple. There are so many moving parts when it comes to elections. In fact, the United States has probably one of the most complex systems, where we have a federal level that has quite a bit of oversight joined together with states that also have a lot of say in the election processes that happens in their entities. And then you bring in the local entities, counties, cities that are running the elections on the ground that also join into that effort. So we have this institutional piece that's very complex. And then you start to layer in information pieces. You start to layer in the confidence in the election results themselves, and we can see how this gets incredibly complicated. We have 119 days to our next election. And we have seen a number of hitches in recent times, but they have seemed to become more and more frequent, these hitches. You know, for me, I think the one that stands out most was the 2000, the butterfly ballot in the presidential election. And that's That's the big example. But then in our state and local levels, we're seeing other examples as recently as the primary election in Wisconsin and Georgia. So to start to unpack all of these multiple moving parts that are part of our electoral system, our democratic base, we have with us today Larry Norden and LaShawn Warren, who should be joining us momentarily. There she is. Hello, LaShawn. So without further ado, I'm not going to talk anymore. I want you guys to do the talking here. You guys are the experts. And thinking about elections, it's a holistic process. It's not just, you know, the act of voting and that's it. So I want to spend some time on registration, because as we move into election season, traditionally we have the door knocking campaigns, we have big rallies, concerts where folks are approached to register to vote, but there's none of that right now in our COVID reality. So Larry, I wanted you to talk to us about what registration looks like in this moment in time.
Yeah, that's a great question, Vicki. First of all, thank you so much for including me and LaShawn in this conversation. And we're really grateful to both the LBJ School and the Aspen Institute, the Socrates program, to be here. COVID has upended American life, obviously, and that is also true when it comes to our elections. And you're right to ask about registration first, I think, because everybody, you know, a lot of the conversation around how COVID is going to affect our elections to the extent that it's happening, and frankly, I think it needs to happen more. I think we're facing a really big crisis if we don't take some important actions in the next few weeks. A lot of that conversation is focused on really on mail voting. How are we going to actually cast our ballots, right? But there's a critical step before that. And that's registration. In almost all of the country, you need to be registered before you can vote. Your information needs to be updated to reflect where you live. Registration has taken a big hit this year already because of COVID. Traditionally, the way people register, you mentioned, people knock on doors, their voter registration drives. In fact, a very common way that people register is through their DMV and other government agencies. Those offices aren't open in a lot of the country right now. So we've seen a dramatic drop in registration. My guess is that we're going to see a big increase. August is usually when there's a really big increase. We start to see a really big increase in presidential years for online registration systems. And there are going to have to be other ways to get people registered. It's a big problem. It's very discouraging to see the declining numbers. And you know, one of the first challenges that I think we're going to have to face is there's going to have to be a lot more work done proactively by election offices to get people registered, to send out forms, and to have online registration systems ready for the huge surge in capacity that they're likely going to need starting this summer and going into the fall, with people using those systems more than they usually have in the past.
And Larry, on that point of online registration, I work by examples, by case studies. Who is doing it right? What states can we look to and say, you know, their online system is the one that other folks should be emulating?
That's a good question. And LaShawn may actually have some better thoughts than I do. I don't know that I can point to any state immediately that's doing it right. I will say Pennsylvania has already put in for increasing the capacity of their online system because they are expecting it to get used so much more over the summer than it has in previous years because the other avenues to registration are closed. So I would point to them as taking proactive steps that I think a lot of other states are going to need to. LaShawn, I don't know if you have thoughts on other states that their online systems are particularly good.
You know, I think at this point, there are a lot of states that are trying to adjust to this new reality that we find ourselves in. And so in terms of states that are getting it right, I think that still remains to be seen, to be perfectly honest. So I don't know that I can point to one state that is getting it right, but I know that a number of them are are working towards that end. So there isn't a particular state that I would elevate at this point.
One thing I will say is, you know, a lot of states require you to have a driver's license to register online, and certainly that's something that I think that shouldn't be requiring. You shouldn't have to have a driver's license number to be able to register online. There should be other kinds of ways to authenticate people to make sure that they can register, again, especially now when other avenues for registration are closed.
Right, and the question is, in this new normal, where folks may not be able to get that driver's license to normally register to vote online, I'm also thinking about same-day voter registration. You know, are we going to see different states say, okay, we'll allow for same-day voter registration, or will we see consistent feedback? So I think I'm watching what states are going to be open to changing in light of COVID on this registration piece, you know, liberalizing the registration piece. But moving farther along the process of elections, LaShawn, I want to talk to you about voter suppression, and not the old school voter suppression of our grandparents' generation, you know, not like here in Texas, we still had the all-white primaries in the rest of the South. Sometimes people would be physically barred from voting. You had the poll tax where you literally had to pay $1 to vote. That no longer exists, that insidious form of voter suppression, but that does not mean that voter suppression does not exist today and is not impactful. So I was hoping that you could talk to us about what suppression you're seeing for folks as they try to get to the ballot box.
So thank you so much for that question. I just want to thank you for having me. I'm so glad that I'm able to join this conversation. Obviously, one of the things that is keeping me up at night and many people in the civil rights community is voter suppression. Like, it is top of mind as we look towards the November election. And the forms of voter suppression it has evolved, right? And so we have unfortunately grown accustomed to battling voter suppression in the traditional form, be that purges of a number of minorities, shortening voter registration time periods, early voting, poll closures. Like, we did a poll closure report that indicated that after Shelby County, the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2013 was decided, there were a number of states and jurisdictions that went through a massive poll closure effort. And between 2015 and now, there were over 600 different poll closures around the country in areas that were historically covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. So we're continuing to see that movement. And in light of COVID, the opposite should happen, right? There shouldn't be poll closures. There should be more polling places that are open to allow people more access in order to comply with the CDC guidelines and social distancing. So we're continuing to see that. We're also seeing language access issues creeping up, photo ID requirements that have been insidious and have prevented people from voting. So there are a myriad of ways in which we have seen voter suppression take root. And we've had a number of our coalition partners bring lawsuits around issues around signature matching that disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. And we've been really challenging all of these different various aspects of voter suppression. But one of the areas that I'd like to highlight, if you will, is another form of voter suppression that we really have not paid as much attention to, but it's evolving. And it really came to the fore in 2016 on the Facebook platform with Russian voter interference. And so online voter suppression is like the newest form of suppression that we're seeing. And we're very used to battling other areas of suppression, but the online voter suppression through disinformation and misinformation has been a very difficult beast to combat. It's been very hard, primarily because it happens on a private platform that's largely unregulated. And there aren't any restrictions in terms of the content unless they're self-imposed. And so a lot of us in the civil rights community have been working with platforms to have some level of accountability with respect to the users. And one of the things that we have said to them and impressed upon them, you have a responsibility with this new technology to protect your user. and help them to discern and navigate what they're seeing. And whenever they're seeing bad information, misinformation that's deliberately put out there in order to manipulate people and to get them to act against their best interests, that's deeply problematic. And so not only are we dealing with the more traditional forms of voter suppression, but now we're dealing with disinformation and misinformation at a scale that's unlike anything that we have seen.
Right, LaShawn, when you're talking about the more traditional, the institutional disenfranchisement, I think of my home state of Texas, and I just start checking the boxes, right? Like voter ID, poll closures. In Houston, folks were standing in line for hours upon hours after the polls closed. So you could kind of target your resources more strategically. You know, in the civil rights community, you know your certain problem areas and you can dispatch people there and put that under the microscope. But what you're talking about now, this digital disenfranchisement, is one that we don't know who the actors are, and it's widespread. And this is very scary to me. LaShawn, in digging in further into this, what are you seeing community advocacy groups do to counter this, as opposed to the more traditional forms of voter suppression that we're used to battling against?
What are communities doing in order to address
communities, advocacy groups too? Is it an information campaign?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, we're dealing with the new reality. Like COVID changed everything for us, right? And so we have various groups that would go door to door. They would do get out the vote. They would do voter registration. They would set up in front of grocery stores and things like that in order to make sure that people had access to the ballot box. At this point, just like this virtual town hall, like we have had to make an adjustment and move things that we would traditionally do to virtual spaces. And so we've had to come up with very unique ways in which to educate people about what they're seeing at what they will see at polling place locations, things that they can expect to see, how they can arm themselves, how they can check their voter registration. And what we've ended up doing is using digital platforms, quite honestly, to actually get the message out, to do public education, even around voter suppression efforts on platforms. Like I think we have a responsibility, even if the private industry is not taking that seriously. Some of them are making some steps in order to do that, but in large measure, the civil rights community has been really adamant about not only bringing litigation and challenging traditional voter suppression, but also really challenging various companies about their policies and having them put in community standards that would apply uniformly across the board, regardless of who the speaker is. And one of the things that we've been struggling, quite frankly, with a number of these companies about has been this idea of applying a different standard depending on who the speaker is. If the speaker is a political official, they have been willing to give them a lot more leeway with what they say, even if that information qualifies as disinformation or misinformation, particularly, let's say, about issues regarding mail-in ballots. Like, we've seen a lot of disinformation that's put out there. There have been these efforts, and one of the things that just really keeps me up at night is these efforts to really use rhetoric to cast dispersions on the integrity of the election even before it has taken place. And all of these different options that are available, and options that honestly we have to pursue if we're going to protect the general public and people who have vulnerabilities with respect to their health. I mean, we firmly believe, and I don't want to speak for Larry, that people shouldn't have to choose between their health and the ability to vote, right? And so part of all of this that we're doing is talking, not only litigation, working with some of these businesses, working with legislators, trying to get additional money to the state's emergency funding in order for them to create these other avenues for people to vote. And then also doing the public education, but a lot of that has been virtual.
Yeah. So Larry, coming back to you and looking at the machinery of voting, that critical infrastructure of our voting machines, what is the status of this infrastructure? You know, we've heard a lot of talk about many localities have incredibly outdated machines. How are you feeling? How confident are you feeling about the integrity of this infrastructure?
Yeah, I want to start by saying, for the record, like LaShawn, I agree people shouldn't have to choose between their health and voting. So it was okay to speak for me on that, LaShawn.
Thank you.
Look, we do not, even leaving COVID aside, we do not in the United States invest in our elections and our election infrastructure the way that we should, to ensure that it is an infrastructure that everybody and that it's up to date and that it's secure. COVID has made that challenge, that hole that we're in, even greater. So, you know, no matter what the president or anybody else says or how they feel about it, many, many more people are going to vote by mail in this election. It is a choice that voters are making. In most of the country, not in Texas, but in most of the country, it's a choice that voters have. For the reasons that LaShawn mentioned, and I think that all of us understand, a lot of people say, I'm going to choose not to go to the polling place. I'm going to choose to exercise my right to get an absentee ballot. Our systems were not set up for that. To have so many people choosing voting by mail. Our systems were not set up for people registering online in the numbers that they're likely to. So that by itself, we haven't invested as much in that infrastructure given how much is going to get used this year. And then on top of that, unfortunately, while Congress has provided a little bit more money in recent years for after the 2016 attacks on our election infrastructure, in upgrading that infrastructure. So most states now have voting machines, for instance, if you're voting in person, that have paper backup. Again, Texas is one of the few exceptions that's not uniformly true, but most states do. A lot of states have upgraded their voting machines in recent years, and about the past couple of years, in fact, there's been a big purchase of new systems. It's still very much a patchwork. And I do think that one of the challenges we have in the United States, and Vicki, you mentioned this at the beginning, is our elections are so decentralized that a lot of it just depends on the resources that the jurisdiction where you happen to live has. And very much what we have seen in the United States when we've done analyses on who has the newest equipment, who has the most of it, and this shouldn't be surprising to anybody if you don't have federal funding for this kind of thing, or even statewide funding. It's the wealthier counties and towns that have the newer equipment, that have more of it. And it's the counties and towns with less resources, lower median income, that are struggling with older equipment, that are struggling with less of it. And the consequences should not be surprising to anybody. We see longer lines where systems break down, and you referenced Wisconsin, but Georgia is an even more recent example of that. We can talk about what happened in those places. It was more than just a lack of strong infrastructure, but that certainly was part of it.
And maybe, LaShawn, I'm going to bounce back to you on digging into the case study of Georgia and what has been happening there in terms of both the voter suppression and also the technical piece of voting. What are lessons learned from Georgia as we move forward into November?
I think we can write a whole case book on what went wrong with Georgia. But I'd like to take a step back, because I think that there's a critical piece that we shouldn't overlook, and that is what happened as a result of the dismantling of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So Georgia was one of those states that fell under Section 5 coverage. And just for context, if a state fell under Section 5 coverage, they had to get any changes to their election procedures and process approved by a district court or by the Department of Justice before they implemented it. So there was a prophylactic effort to make sure that there was a racial impact evaluation before any harm could potentially take place. That is not the case now. It definitely it feels a bit like a lot of these jurisdictions, a number of them that are acting in nefarious ways were previously covered by Section 5, and Georgia happens to be one of them. And so some of the issues that we saw coming out of Georgia could have been prevented if Section 5 were still operable, but unfortunately it is not. And I think we just I need to say that, because I think there should be an effort to restore Section 5, because it plays such a critical role. As we know, once a person loses their right to vote, on that day, there is no remedy for that. Once their ballot is thrown out, it's thrown out. There isn't an opportunity to cure if there's a mismatch. So one of the things that we saw in Georgia, we saw a number of ballots discarded. We saw long lines because of inadequate numbers of voting machines. And so in addition to that, I think layered on top of that is a number of those jurisdictions that had inadequate machines and the long lines. They were disproportionately in places where there are communities of color. And so I think another area that is worth mentioning too, particularly around the midterm election, you had a place called Randolph County that had closed at least 9 different polling places, predominantly in African-American communities. And the reason they gave was that it was in violation of the ADA, and there was no way to, they didn't find another location that was ADA compliant. They just closed 9 of the polling places. And it was later discovered that these efforts to try to close the polling places, they were unsuccessful, but these efforts to try to close the polling places appeared to be politically motivated. And so we just need to kind of situate what Section 5 could have done if it were still operable in these particular situations. And Georgia is not unlike a lot of other places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin, where we were seeing quite a bit of spoiled ballots for reasons that I can't really explain, but I'm sure Larry has a lot more information about some of these other jurisdictions that have been having tremendous difficulty, particularly in this COVID crisis situation. I think it just underscores, outside of not having DOJ supervision and approval, it is absolutely critical for these jurisdictions that are hemorrhaging money. These states are hemorrhaging money given the number of deaths and the ways that they needed to spend resources that they have right now. They need money to actually conduct a fair and inclusive election. And so our organization, as well as the Brennan Center and several others, have been pushing really hard for the Senate and the House to include additional emergency funding in order to have a fair and inclusive election in November.
And LaShawn, thank you so much for digging into Section 5. I mean, this is critical to the conversation, the rollback of it, but also with the larger context of the Department of Justice that we're facing right now. So any other mechanisms that would hold under the Voting Rights Act are not at, I guess perhaps we could say, at full capacity. Really quickly, let me just let the audience know that we'd love to take questions. We're going to leave a little bit of time at the end of this session for you all to engage with both LaShawn and Larry. So feel free to put your questions in to the Q&A. But what I do want to do is I want to talk a little bit more about vote at home, because quite frankly, before COVID, for a lot of folks, maybe outside of your Oregons or your Colorados, it wasn't top of mind. And I want to step back and take COVID away and ask about the pros and cons of vote at home, because we hear the cases in North Carolina about the ballot harvesting fiasco. And then, we hear about, perhaps them not getting sent in time through the post office to be counted. On the pro side, you have it's safer, it's easier, it's quicker, but maybe Larry and both LaShawn, if you could weigh into the pros and cons of vote at home more generally, and then we can narrow in the COVID context.
Yeah, so, just as with in-person voting, how you conduct vote at home, mail voting, varies dramatically from place to place. The rules around it, and when votes are counted, how they're counted, what the process is for getting ballots back. So it's hard to generalize. And one of the things I think that's important to understand in the current debate around mail balloting is that a lot of states don't have particularly good rules in place for making sure that we're counting every vote that is cast by mail or sent by mail. So, if you're talking about, frankly, I'll use the example of New York, where I live, where I am right now. You talk about vote at home in New York versus vote at home in Oregon. It's very different. And frankly, my vote is much more likely to be counted in Oregon than it is if I cast it in New York, just because the rules around if there are errors on when you return the ballot are much more restrictive in New York. They don't do any job of contacting the voter if they fail to sign in the right place or use the right envelope to return, and so they just won't count those ballots. And we're seeing this right now in New York State. We just had a primary, and there are reports. The counting has been extremely slow, but there are reports of in some places 20-25%. It's insane, of the ballots not being counted. That would never happen in Oregon. So I do think vote at home is very convenient for people if it's done well. There's been some demonstration that at least for low turnout elections, it increases turnout, which is a good thing. The kind of off-year elections that people may forget about if the ballots are mailed to them. But I do think that a lot of the country, I mean, we have to do it this year. We're going to do it, but a lot of the country, the rules aren't built in to make sure that we're maximizing access and counting of ballots, even if, as I said earlier, in most states, most people are going to have the option to do it. I have to say, on the security issue, I'll say this very quickly because I don't want to take up too much more time, but I'm not too worried about that. Like states like Oregon, Colorado, Utah, Hawaii, where everybody gets a mail ballot, we've learned a lot about how to ensure that those systems are secure. So there's a lot of fear mongering about whether or not there could be fraud against the system. It's extremely unlikely. It's extremely rare. And in the situations like North Carolina that you mentioned, they're caught because we have so many good security measures in place.
LaShawn, what is your view of vote at home, coming from your perspective, more of the civil rights on the ground?
So I agree with everything that Larry said. I actually used to live in Seattle, Washington, so I experienced vote by mail personally for many years, and it was a very effective system. I really liked it because I was able to sit down in the quietness of my home and look at the ballot very carefully. I wasn't rushed. And I think that was a huge benefit. And there were safeguards that were put in place to prevent nefarious activity, so it can be done well. It has been done well. For some states, this is a case of first impression, but it can be done. And so I think there are there's enough information out there and enough of a blueprint out there in order for states to use that in order to conduct a fair election. And for us, access matters, right? I have an 82-year-old mother, and I want her to be able to participate. And I don't want her to have to go to a polling place and compromise her health because she wants to vote. She's not going to miss an election. And there are a number of people who fall into that category. And I from a civil rights perspective, we should maximize all options in order to allow people to participate in the process, because these elections matter. Like for people of color who have to vote for a district attorney who determines whether they're going to prosecute a police officer or not, that matters. For judges, it matters. And how resources are allocated, it matters. We elect these government officials who are now determining who gets relief from this COVID package and who doesn't. So having the ability to participate in this process is critical for us. And so from our perspective, we need to exhaust every option possible to ensure that everyone who's eligible can have an opportunity to participate in the process. It's unfair otherwise.
And I'll defer to both of you on this, but what I've been seeing is also that vote at home, if done right, actually saves money. So when you're talking about more fiscally conservative areas, this potentially is a way to cut costs. All right. We have about 10 more minutes. I have two big questions that I've been dying to ask you both before we move over to Q&A. We've edged around them, but if you had to pick maybe the top two things that you were worried about, LaShawn, you've talked about one of them that keeps you up at night, but give me another, and then we're going to walk through those. And Larry as well, what are the top two things that you are most worried about as we come into the November election?
So, I mean, there are a number of things that fall into that.
Give me more. You don't have to give me two.
Right. I mean, I will say, I know you said two, but I think I've hit on most all of them. It is the online space that troubles me quite a bit. It is the unknown factor. And then there are other unknown factors as well related to COVID, because we don't know what is going to happen. I mean, the only certainty we have is uncertainty at this point. And we're trying to be as prepared as possible. But we don't know what the future holds, right? And so we want to be as prepared as possible. And I think being able to get funding, so I think funding is top of mind for me to the states in order to be able to provide as many options as possible for people to participate. And the second thing that's top of mind for me, not only online spaces, but the traditional spaces, is voter suppression. It is clear that this country is very divided right now. And there is clearly efforts underfoot to suppress participation from particular communities. That is very clear. And that the various ways in which that is manifesting itself is, quite frankly, frightening. And it's sad in this moment, particularly with the murder of Mr. Floyd, with COVID disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities, that there is an effort underfoot to suppress that particular community, those particular communities who really need to have a voice at this critical moment. And then I would say, in addition to that, with respect to the online voter suppression, the disinformation and misinformation, just making, one of the things that I am concerned about is the ethical behavior of these companies and their willingness to stop voter suppression on their platform, disinformation and misinformation that's targeted to particular communities to intimidate them or to suppress their participation. And I hope that in the coming months that there will be an effort underway to really harness the energy of the community and the general public to really address these issues in a meaningful way, and that these companies hold themselves accountable for some of the content that's spread on the harmful content that's spread on their platform.
Larry, your worries.
Well, I would echo everything that LaShawn said. I in addition to all of that, I'm concerned about the legitimacy of in the public perception of the legitimacy of this election. So, and that takes a couple of forms. One, LaShawn mentioned funding. Folks should know, like, the next two or 3 weeks should tell us whether or not Congress is going to step in and make sure that states and localities have the resources they need to avoid the kinds of problems that we saw in Wisconsin and Georgia and many other places in the primaries. That they're able to process mail ballot applications when they come in, and that they are able to ensure that enough polling places are open and kept safe, so that people can vote in them. And we don't have the 7-8 hour lines that we saw in Milwaukee or Atlanta. I'm very concerned that if those resources aren't provided, we're not going to just see what we saw in Milwaukee and Atlanta and Washington, D.C., that it could be even worse, because, of course, there's going to be so much more strain on the system. There's going to be so much more participation, and it's going to be a national election. And so I really do want to kind of sound the alarm over the next couple of weeks. It's really, and frankly, the states and localities, we can push them, but they just don't have the money. It's Congress that's going to have to provide it. So that's one concern about legitimacy. And then, frankly, there's the second disinformation-related question around legitimacy. And this echoes a little bit what LaShawn said, but kind of the other side of the coin, I think. You know, our elections were attacked in 2016. I have no doubt we're going to see disinformation attempting to delegitimize the election in 2020. I have no doubt that you know, we're already seeing comments frankly from the president and from others questioning the legitimacy of an election that hasn't even happened yet, worried about, you know, false claims about mail voting and other things. You know, this is going to be an election like no other that we have not seen in the United States. We're not going to know, very likely, on election night who won, who lost. And that's an opportunity for creating a lot of confusion. And so I do think that with all the disinformation that's out there, it's really going to be incumbent, not just on groups like the Leadership Conference and the Brennan Center and election officials, but everybody to make sure that the public understands the facts of this election, to make sure that they understand that because it's going to take some time to count, that doesn't mean there's anything nefarious going on. I think that's going to be critical and difficult.
So we started out in looking at the holistic process of the election. We have, you know, the first part, registration, and then you vote. And then the last piece, which is such a critical piece and really what makes a democracy, is the confidence in that result. And as you just pointed out, Larry, right now we're facing, you know, more likely than not, where we're not going to know the outcome of the election, simply because the votes were not counted. Something that would, you know, I start having visions of 2000 all over again. What I do want to end on is calls to action, what folks can do to better engage in election reform, to help their communities. Y'all are as plugged in as it gets. So what are a couple of resources for regular folks like myself to help to try to make a difference in ensuring the integrity of our electoral process, both for the short term, but for the longer term?
I can start us off. I think next week, Senator McConnell is going to be introducing a package of stimulus reforms to help with the COVID crisis. And I think it would be helpful for as many people as possible to write their senator saying, look, elections are critical. States need money, and urge their senator to support it. Like states need money. I can't really emphasize that enough. I mean, I echo everything that Larry has said. We are at a critical moment. And this is an election that we have not, the likes of which we have not seen. And it is consequential beyond any words that I can actually frame at this moment. The stakes are very high. You know, folks are dying, you know, look, and it matters. It matters who is in office and who governs. And so I would say if folks could just weigh in, not only at the federal level, but some of the states and localities, they have money, right? And so people have a say in how that money is spent. And so I would encourage the audience to make sure that they are weighing in on how the money should be spent, you know, making sure that there are as many options as possible, including mail-in ballots, so that people do not have to put themselves in harm's way in order to participate in the process. So that's one way. Another way. And then there are local organizations that are doing, they're undertaking a number of efforts to make sure that people are registered to vote, that they check their registration, and that they actually participate in the political process. And you know, there's the NAACP. There are lots of organizations within our network and just local organizations that are doing this kind of work. And you know, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of the organizing at this point has gone virtual. And so it is incumbent upon us even to reach out to our family members, our friends. We can start these trees where one person emails 5 people and say, are you registered to vote? Make sure, you know, you check your ballot. Like, do you know have a plan of action for what happens on election day if you're going to go to the polls? And, you know, one other area is one other thing that people could also do is help with poll workers. I think that folks need to make health decisions for themselves, but one of the reasons why there aren't as many polling places is a lot of these local jurisdictions, they just don't have the number of resources and capacity in order to process voters. And so it is a need that's out there. I think people have to make that determination, obviously, for themselves. I'm not encouraging people to put themselves in harm's way necessarily, but I'm saying that is a need. And if people feel like that's a way that they want to help, it is something that would be tremendously beneficial, but particularly because there are a number of the poll workers are generally older in age, and a lot of them are just precluded by virtue of that fact from serving as poll workers in the elections moving forward.
Sean said almost everything I wanted to say, so you still.
I'm sorry,
Sean. I'll just echo, what LaShawn said about poll workers. If you look at what happened in Milwaukee, in the Atlanta metro area, a lot of it was poll workers canceling at the last minute. Understandable, they were scared. But the more poll workers we have, the less likely you're going to see repeated scenes of that. That is going to be a critical thing. Just generally, I would say election offices are understaffed. So any offer of help that you can provide to election offices, I think, would probably be welcome to your local election office to find out what you can do. Checking your voter registration, making sure that everybody else does. There are, as LaShawn said, there are groups that do this. One that I know is called Markers for Democracy, that like writes to people to get them registered, to get them requesting mail ballots. That kind of voter education, I think, is very important. And then finally, I would just echo what LaShawn said about funding. There's the fight over the next couple of weeks in Congress, making sure that your members, your senators know that this is something you care about, but then at the local level too. In your county, there are going to be tough decisions to be made. And just generally, elections fall last when it comes to budget priorities, right? It's not the same as in kind of people's everyday thoughts as education or the roads, and those things are really important too. But I think this year, it's critical for the people who are in charge of making decisions about budgets to understand that the public really does care this year, that there's adequate funding of elections, and that we have a legitimate election.
Well, Larry and LaShawn, thank you so much. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Cordell Carter, who is going to tackle the number of questions that we have.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and thank you, Larry and LaShawn. This has been fantastic. I'll jump right into the questions here. LaShawn, I'm a former resident of Washington State as well, and I seem to remember the mail-in ballots. In fact, when I moved back to the East Coast, I was like, where's my ballot? I have to actually go. And I just wonder to both of you, since voting is a state-controlled issue, what's to prevent everyone from requesting a mail-in ballot and getting it in time?
Larry.
Well, the first is laws. In some states, and Texas is one of them, but there are others. Right now, voters don't have that option to request a mail ballot unless they have they fall within a certain number of excuses. And so laws have to change in those. There are 14 states that don't have no excuse mail voting, although some of those states I think are going to relax rules this year to make sure that people can, if they want to, request their ballots. There are a few, Texas, Alabama, where Missouri may be another, where the officials may not change the rules. So certainly raising hell about that, I think, people should do, because I think everybody should have that choice. I'd say the second thing is, unfortunately, unless we get some more money from Congress, we saw this in Georgia, and we've seen it in other places. The infrastructure isn't there in some of those places to make sure that all the requests are processed in time. So the other thing that I would say for folks is, I mean, this is my own view, in this election, this fall, people should be voting as early as possible. They should be requesting those mail ballots on day one if they've decided that they want to vote by mail, because we've seen in too many of the primaries people who requested late, they got their ballots too late, and they weren't able to send them back in time.
Great. And LaShawn, perhaps you can provide with us for us some landscape of who are the organizations out there. Say someone online, I see there's about 75 people that join us today. They want to be, participate in this effort. They want to send money to an organization that is helping people, exercise their right to vote. Which three organizations would you identify that are really making things happen around?
Oh my gosh, you're putting me in trouble. Like we have over 220 different organizations.
Oh my gosh!
Coalition, right? And so,
okay, what's the website?
It's fairly substantial.
Okay, fine.
I will say this: there is an organization that does a fantastic job of putting this program together. It's called Election Protection. It's the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And they have this whole election protection program, and they partner with a number of organizations, including the Brennan Center, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. We all work together, but they have this massive operation where they're field calls, and they problem shoot and problem solve, and they help us sort of navigate what can be very difficult terrain because, as Larry pointed out, these states have different laws and they are not all the same. And so they have been meticulous in actually documenting what the rules and the regulations are for each one of the states. And so I would say if there was a program that I would uplift at this moment, that would certainly be one of them.
Election protection. Great. Okay, related to this, I don't know if it was the Daily I heard this morning or I read it in a newspaper, some questions about the capability of the U.S. Postal Service. So assuming someone was able to get their ballot in, there may be some issues there. Have you all been following this issue with the Postal Service? And do you see this as a concern, or is it overhyped at this point?
I'm concerned. I think, again, this funding fight that we're seeing in Congress over the next couple of weeks may have some impact on what this looks like in the fall. But I'm absolutely concerned. This is another reason for requesting your mail ballot early. One thing I think that a lot of people may not realize when we say mail voting is you don't have to return your ballot by mail. So that's you can in a lot of places, in a lot of states, there are what are called drop boxes, and they may be all over your county, where you can take your mail ballot and deliver it. And in every state, there is at least one place in your county where you can hand deliver your mail ballot. So understandable, a lot of people are concerned about returning their ballot by mail. And in fact, in states like Colorado, which we often call like an all-mail state, most people don't mail back their ballots. They actually return them in person. So that's an option for everybody if you're concerned that your ballot might not make it back in time.
Interesting.
It really underscores the need for the public education that Victoria talked about. Like, we're living in a different reality, right? And so the rules have changed a little bit to accommodate and to address issues related to COVID. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to try to help as many people as possible with public education campaigns and just make sure that we're familiarizing ourselves and spread the word about the different options that are available and ways that people can vote.
I'm glad you mentioned public information, the need for education, because the next two questions I'm going to combine into one are all about disinformation. And an anonymous attendee, very smart move, said, what are the merits of shutting down social media for 1 to 2 weeks prior to the November election? The merits and perhaps the reasons why we can or cannot do that.
So I'll start, and Larry can end us. One of the things that I think this is foundational, and that is Facebook and Twitter and these other platforms, they're private, right? And they're largely unregulated, right? So if there's going to be a blackout period, it is a decision that they make. It is not a decision the federal government makes. We can advocate for it, but it is their decision. And I'm sure as many of your viewers may know, there is constant debate at this moment about regulating social media platforms. And that is one of the reasons why they have a tremendous reach. I think right now they have over 2 billion users. And as we saw in 2016, they have the ability to sway an election. I mean, they have the ability to, I mean, the platform is such that the way that they operate is they drive information to people. It's curated. It's not a situation where they're a neutral platform and they just provide information like a library, where you walk into the library, you say, oh, I want to read this book on cooking. You know, look at any book in the library. That is not the way it works. It is almost as if you walk into the library, someone comes to you and they take you to a particular section and say, here, read these 3 books. That is how the platform works. And that is the business model. So they are not a neutral player. It is a significant problem. And unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of options to make them have a blackout period, or to even put in these policies that we're talking about voter suppression and their community standards. It is something that they're doing on their own volition. And so I am pleased that they are moving in the right direction, but there are people, particularly political officials with the largest bully pulpit that's pushing out disinformation that's very harmful. And I think that has to be addressed. And there's a question about whether federal regulation is the answer to that.
Larry, you have the last word.
Yeah, I do want to say, this is a really tough question. I agree with LaShawn that more needs to be done. But of course, especially this year with COVID, the inability to reach people, I would be worried about a total blackout that would get misused. And so the kind of organizing, outreach, get out the vote might be swept into that, which could be really challenging. This is tricky. And if I have more faith in the social media companies to be able to make those distinctions and ensure that they weren't preventing that kind of activity from happening, then I might be more open to it. But I would be very afraid if there was some kind of, if Facebook and Twitter just said we're having a blackout on any of that kind of conversation happening, that it could actually do more harm than good.
Wow. Well, a whole lot to say and do on this particular topic. So I thank you, Larry and LaShawn, for joining us. I also thank our partners in this enterprise, the Futures Forum at the LBJ School, Dr. Francisco Soto. Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you, Ms. Robb, who founded the forum, Lemuel Williams, who was our moderator today. I just want to do a quick plug for the next series. We do a 4-part series coming up. Next week, we'll do one on allyship. Then the next week on the 30th, we're doing a seminar on moving from the performative to the normative. So talking about corporate behavior, blackout squares versus changing hiring practices. Then we have executive perspectives from our CEO and the CEO of a leading business association. And lastly, on August the 13th, we're going to actually have some folks that are responding from the private sector, private equity markets, and like, how can we get more resources to communities that have been left out? Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. As always, you'll find this on our website, Aspen Institute Socrates. We look forward to seeing you all again. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.